Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm here with a few techniques using some background stamps. I'm going to be using all background stamps from Simon Hurley Create today, as well as the Stark White Cardstock, which is great for just about everything, as well as the Simon Hurley Create die inks. So for the first technique, we are going to be doing some emboss resist, which I'm sure we have all done before. I'm using the Splinter background stamp, which is kind of like a wood grain. I treated my card panel there, which is the Stark White Cardstock, with my anti-static tool. I have my stamp laying face down on my work surface here with the red rubber facing up. I inked that really well with Versamark ink, and I'm just using a scrap piece of paper to lay that down, kind of rubbing my hands and fingers all over it to make sure that I'm getting a really good impression on the card panel. Being it's clear sticky ink, we can't really exactly see where we stamped. I'm taking some white embossing powder here and sprinkling this over my entire card panel, and then I have my heat gun off to the side, heating up, getting nice and hot before actually bringing that to the card panel. We have to heat set this entire card panel, so having it preheated will minimize the warping that we get. This is a nice thick cardstock, and so far the best that I've seen for heat embossing. You see that I got hardly any warping at all. So next we're going to do some ink blending here, and I'm going to be using two of the Simon Hurley Create inks. I'm using Woof and Grr. I love the names of these inks. So I'm starting off with the Woof, which is kind of like a warm gray. And I'm taking a blending brush here, and I'm just applying this pretty much over my entire card panel, but I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend. So you can see that I have some splotchy areas, and normally I'd kind of blend those out, but in this case I'm not really worried about it. It's going to be more of a masculine card, and it's going to kind of have like a weathered wood look to it, so I don't really care. So once that's covered with the gray or the woof, I'm going to take some of the Grr, which is more of a brown tone, and I'm using that same blending brush, no need to get another one, and I'm just going to go around the edges. You can see that I'm working on a scrap piece of paper, and when I put my brush down, I'm starting on the scrap piece of paper and kind of working my way onto the panel. Now, I got a little heavy-handed here. So I thought I was going to be able to kind of blend this out with the woof, but I wasn't really able to. So I just, with a very light hand, went across the panel and kind of gave that blotchy look with that Grr, or that brown ink. Now, once all of my ink blending was done, you kind of lose some of the lines from the embossed areas. So I'm going to take a dry paper towel, and I'm just going to rub that across the entire card panel, and this will clean off the ink that's kind of sitting on top of the embossing powder now that you can really see that image shine through. So that's the first technique. The second technique is also going to be embossing. However, we're going to do our ink blending first and last. So I have Traffic Cone, Slippery When Wet, Over the Moon, and Overzealous inks here. And I have a piece of the Stark White Cardstock. And you can see here that I'm going in with a very light hand. You don't want to be too heavy-handed unless you're using extremely light colors. For the two yellows, I'd probably be okay. But for that orangish color, which is probably my favorite out of all of them, it's kind of like a coral color. It's called Traffic Cone. I love it. And I'm also not worried about blending all that well. I'm just trying to get the color down. Now the one yellow was a little bit pale, so you'll see I'll come back to that later, but I'm not adding a ton of ink here, and I'm not worried about all the colors blending nicely together. Just want to get all the colors down. So once you do have all of your ink down, you are going to want to let your panel dry for probably about 15 minutes or so. Before you move on to the next step, just test it. I have some clear embossing powder here, and I'm just going to sprinkle that on. If it sticks, it's not ready yet. You can heat set it, but I didn't. I just let it dry because I don't want any warping at all. So I'm going to test this again. Doesn't stick to any areas. We're good to go. So this time I'm going to bring out my MISTI. I find that a stamp positioner with background stamps does work best for me. I am going to take a little bit of the Tombow Mono Multi Glue and squirt that and spread that around on the back of my card panel and let that dry. Once that is dry, it becomes repositionable, and that way my card panel won't shift around as I'm inking up my stamp because I'm more than likely going to have to stamp it twice. So I'm going to use the flower garden background stamp here. I just lined that over my card panel, and I am going to go ahead and ink that up again with the Versamark clear sticky ink. I did treat my card panel with my anti-static tool, which is a definite must, especially when you've already done some ink blending. Even though the ink is dry, it tends to stay a little sticky for a little bit. So I'm going to ink this up real good and stamp this down. And I did stamp this twice because, like I said, it is a clear ink, so we can't necessarily see exactly where we stamped or if we got a good impression each and every time. And you'll notice once I move on to the next step, I did not, but I'm okay with that because it kind of gives it a distressed look. So I went ahead and stamped that twice, and I'm going to take some clear embossing powder, and this is by Ranger, and sprinkle that over my entire card panel. And once again, I have my heat gun heating up to the side, making sure I heat that up for about 30 to 45 seconds or so before bringing that to the card panel. Now the clear embossing powder, when you're sprinkling it onto your card panel there, it looks white. It looks pretty much white. But as you heat it up, you'll see that it becomes clear and shiny. So just make sure that every single area is completely heat set before going on to the next step of ink blending, or else you're going to get embossing powder in areas that you don't want it to. It's going to get stuck to your blending brush or blending tool, whatever you're using, and it's just going to make a big mess. So just double check to make sure that everything is heat set before moving on. So next I'm going to take the Remember Me ink, which is a darker blue. It's not real dark, but it's significantly darker than the inks that I've used. So you want to make sure that whatever ink you're using here is darker than the ones you put down first. And I'm just going to go ahead and cover up the entire card panel. And you can see that it's completely covering all of the ink that I have showing there. But all of the embossed areas will still have that ink that we laid down first showing through. Once again, once all my ink was down, I'm going to go ahead and take a paper towel, make sure it's dry, and just rub that over the entire panel, and you'll see all of those colors shining through. So next we're going to go ahead and move on to some multicolored stamping. I used the Tabo Mono Multi Glue again on the back part of my card panel there until it was dry. Stuck that down to my MISTI, and this time I'm going to be using the Sea Floor background stamp and Traffic Cone, Rosy Cheeks, Triple Berry, and Clear Skies dye ink. And we're going to use all four, and all we're going to do is stamp. So I'm going to start off with the Traffic Cone, and I'm just going to ink up the top portion of my stamp. Taking my stamp chamois there and kind of just dabbing it. I'm not really rubbing away the color. I'm just kind of making it a little bit so it's not such a clean edge. Going to go ahead and completely clean off my stamp and then move on to the Rosy Cheeks, and I'm going to ink the next layer, I guess you could say, and that will be right underneath where I put the Traffic Cone. Again, taking my stamp chamois, but this time dabbing it on the top and bottom of where I put that Rosy Cheeks. And then once you stamp that down, you'll see that the two inks blend very nicely together. They kind of give it an ombre look. You just want to make sure that you're cleaning your stamp off each and every time in between. Next, moving on to the Triple Berry, and I once again taking that stamp chamois and dabbing that onto the top and bottom. Now, using a stamp positioner for this is helpful because it's basically right next to your card panel, and you can kind of use that as a guide so you know exactly where you need to ink up the stamp. I did have some cat hair on there, so I was able to get that away, but if you look real close, you can still see that there's a little bit of an impression where I had a Frankie hair. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off with the Clear Skies, and you can see that my ink pad is extremely juicy. This is the first time I'm using this ink pad, so it is very juicy. I did kind of dab that up a little bit more than maybe the other colors just because I found that when I was inking up the stamp there, I had some kind of gushing out. So I went ahead and stamped that down, and you can see all of these colors blend nicely together, and you kind of get an ombre look there. So next we're going to do some alcohol ink lift. So I'm using some alcohol pearls and the blending solution, except for this is not Yupo paper. It's not poster board. It's the original alcohol ink cardstock, which doesn't really work for this technique. So don't do exactly what I do. It works, but it doesn't work as good. I'm just using 3 different colors here, and you can see that it doesn't spread like it does on Yupo paper. They will blend, they will spread a little bit, but you can kind of see that they're all pooling in the middle. So I had to kind of keep tipping back and forth the card panel to let that kind of drip to the edges and not pool up in the center. And I got a completely different look, and I kind of liked the drippy look. So I added even more of the ink to the very top of the card panel and let that drip down. I didn't necessarily have to add any more of the blending solution because there was so much ink on the paper. It kind of just did everything on its own. So I did let this panel dry for about a half an hour. Alcohol ink does not take all that long to dry, but you do want to make sure that it is 100% dry before moving on to the next step. And you can tell if it's sticky or if you touch it and you have ink left over on your finger, it's not dry. So I'm going to be using the classic flannel background stamp for this one. Again, bringing in my MISTI, adding a little bit of that Tombow Mono multi-glue to the back of that card panel, letting that dry, and then sticking that down onto my MISTI. Lining up my background stamp here, and I'm going to be using the Alcohol Lift ink, also by Ranger. Now this is also a clear ink, so it's very hard to tell when you're inking up the stamp if you've missed any areas. So you'll see as I'm inking up the stamp, I'm going over and over and over the same areas just to make sure that I have plenty of ink on the stamp. I'm going to go ahead and close my MISTI door. I do let this sit for a couple of seconds, adding a whole lot of pressure, and what it's supposed to do, it's supposed to lift the ink. And it did, but it didn't have the results that I was looking for that I get on Yupo paper. So it's very, very hard to see on camera, but I did get a little bit of the lift on the alcohol ink paper or the cardstock. But this time I'm just bringing in some white cardstock and I'm stamping that down again, just using whatever ink is on that stamp. And you get a very subtle look. It's more of a pastel look, and it's kind of like a watercolor-ish look. It's not clean, but it makes a pretty background. So for the 5th and final technique here, we are going to use the Piano Recital background stamp, which is actually 3 different pieces. So you're actually getting 3 different stamps. So I'm going to go ahead and line them up, and I'm going to line them up exactly the way they were intended, close my MISTI door, and then I'm going to remove the center one. I'm going to stamp the 2 that remain, so the top and the bottom, with the Woof ink, which is that warm gray ink, because I just want a very subtle background here. Once that was stamped down, I'm going to take that middle piece that we have already taken out, and I'm just going to line that back up exactly where it belongs. So I'm leaving the other 2 pieces that we've already stamped with there so that I can line this up perfectly. Once it's lined up, I'll remove the 2 that we've already used, and then I'm going to ink this up with Bee Sting ink, which is red, very deep red. And go ahead and stamp that down, and then they'll be lined up perfectly onto my card panel. Very, very simple background. So I'm going to give you a quick look at all of the cards. I did add sentiments from the Dudes 2 stamp set, which they pretty much just say, I made you a card, which I love. I love that sentiment. And I trimmed down some of the panels, added a little bit of a border, but pretty much kept these very, very simple. I hope this was helpful, guys. I will leave all of the supplies listed below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.